A wild dog was seen leading a pack of wolves, something unimaginable. This coexistence defied all known rules of nature. A hunter sets out to find answers to this mystery. His discovery revealed a story that changed everything we knew about wildlife. Snow fell softly on the small town of Pine Creek, a place lost among the mountains of northern Montana, where legends intertwined with reality as naturally as the mist mingled with the ancient pines. It was a particularly cold February, and the townspeople took refuge in their stone and wooden houses, sharing stories by the fire while the wind howled through the cobblestone streets. But tonight, the stories being shared were different. Whispers about an extraordinary creature had begun to circulate, a wild dog living among wolves. Old Tom, the elderly man who ran the town's only store, was the first to see it during one of his morning walks to collect medicinal herbs. "I swear on my life that I saw it with these eyes," insisted Old Tom, gently tapping the wooden table at the local cafe. It was as big as a wolf, but its shape, its way of moving, there's no doubt it was a dog. And the strangest thing is that the wolves followed it, as if it were one of them. Ethan Hunter listened to these stories from the farthest corner of the cafe, his dark eyes fixed on the cup of black coffee he held between his calloused hands. As the town's most respected hunter, he had learned to distinguish between fantastic stories and real signs of the forest. However, something in the tales about this mysterious dog resonated deep within his being. "What do you think, Ethan?" asked Sarah, the young veterinarian who had arrived in town just 6 months ago from the city. "Is it possible for a dog to survive among wolves?" Ethan looked up, meeting Sarah's curious eyes. For a moment, the memory of Ranger, his former hunting companion, flashed through his mind like a bolt of pain. "Anything is possible in the forest," he finally replied, his voice deep and measured. "But nature has its own rules." Sarah pulled up a chair to sit across from him. "I've been studying similar cases," she commented, pulling out a worn notebook from her bag. "There are records of dogs adapting to wildlife, but living in harmony with a wolf pack, and that's extraordinary." Their conversation was interrupted by the abrupt entrance of Jake Thompson into the cafe. Tall and burly, with a scar crossing his left cheek, Jake was known to be the most ambitious and least scrupulous hunter in the region. "Still talking about that ghost dog?" he scoffed, approaching the bar. "I'll bet you anything I'll have it captured before the month is out." An uncomfortable silence fell over the place. Ethan felt his muscles tense, but maintained his composure. Sarah, for her part, couldn't contain her indignation. "And what do you plan to do with it if you capture it?" she asked, her voice tinged with disgust. "There are collectors who would pay a fortune for a creature like that," Jake replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Or maybe some zoo. Who knows?" Ethan slowly rose from his seat, leaving some coins on the table. "Forest creatures are not trophies, Jake," he said as he headed for the door. "Some mysteries deserve to remain as such." That night, as the full moon illuminated the snow-capped mountains, Ethan lay awake in his cabin, methodically cleaning his tracking equipment. On the wall, the faded photograph of him with Ranger seemed to observe him with melancholic eyes. It had been 5 years since he lost his companion on that fateful hunt, and since then something inside him had transformed. He took his old leather journal, flipping through the pages until he found a blank space. In careful handwriting, he began to write, "Tomorrow at dawn I will set out into the forest. If there is a dog that has found its place among wolves, I need to understand how. Perhaps in the process, I'll find the answers I've been searching for all these years." The wind continued to whisper among the trees, bringing with it the distant howl of wolves. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt that the forest was calling him with an urgency he couldn't ignore. Dawn had barely begun to tint the sky when Ethan entered the forest. The snow crunched under his boots as he advanced with sure steps, his breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. He carried with him the essentials, his rifle for precaution, though he hoped not to use it, his leather journal, and enough provisions for several days. As he walked, memories of that last hunt with Ranger began to emerge from the corners of his mind where he had buried them. It had been a morning similar to this one 5 years ago, when everything changed. The trail of a wounded deer had led them beyond their usual hunting grounds, venturing into the wildest part of the forest. "I should have paid more attention to the signs," he muttered to himself, stopping his steps to examine some marks in the snow. They were fresh tracks, different from the ones he was looking for, but equally revealing. Wolves have been hunting here recently. A noise in the bushes put him on alert. Sarah emerged from the vegetation, carrying a backpack and equipped with binoculars. "Good morning, Ethan," she greeted with a determined smile. "I was hoping to find you here." "Sarah, this is no place for—" Ethan began, but she interrupted him. "I'm a veterinarian, remember? If there's a dog living among wolves, I need to document it. Besides," she added, pulling out a map from her backpack, "I've been marking all the reported sightings. There's a pattern." Ethan hesitated for a moment, but the determination in Sarah's eyes was undeniable. Plus, her professional knowledge could be valuable. "All right," he finally conceded, "but you must follow my instructions to the letter. The forest doesn't forgive mistakes." As they advanced together, Sarah shared her theories. "I've been researching similar cases in other parts of the world. Most dogs that join wolf packs are rejected or don't survive. But there are exceptions, cases where the dog brings something valuable to the pack." "Like what?" asked Ethan, genuinely intrigued. "Adaptive intelligence," Sarah replied, ducking under a low branch. "Dogs have evolved alongside humans for thousands of years. They've developed unique skills for problem solving, understanding human patterns. If this dog is really living with the pack, it must be using those skills for the benefit of the group." A distant howl interrupted their conversation. Ethan raised a hand, signaling Sarah to stop. He crouched to examine the ground, and his eyes lit up with recognition. "Look at this," he whispered, pointing to a set of tracks. "The wolf marks are deep, decisive, but these," he pointed to other intermingled tracks, "are different, more calculated, as if the animal was evaluating each step." Sarah took out her camera and began photographing the tracks. "It's fascinating," she murmured. "The distance between the paw prints suggests an animal the size of a German shepherd or similar, but the movement pattern—" A crackle in the distance alerted them. Through the trees they could make out a figure moving. It was Jake, accompanied by two men carrying cages and capture equipment. "I should have guessed he wouldn't waste time," Ethan growled, his voice barely a whisper. "He's following the same trail we are." Sarah clenched her fists in frustration. "We can't let him capture the dog. If it's really integrated into the pack, separating it could be devastating, both for it and for the wolves." Ethan watched Jake and his companions move away in the wrong direction and made a decision. "I know these forests better than anyone," he said, turning in a new direction. "There's an old hunter's route that will allow us to get ahead, but first I need to show you something." He guided Sarah through a barely visible path until they reached a small clearing. In the center, partially covered by snow, was an old leather collar. "This is the place where I lost Ranger," Ethan explained, his voice laden with contained emotion. "I never found his body, just this collar." Sarah knelt beside the collar, studying it carefully. "Ethan," she said slowly, "have you considered the possibility?" But before she could finish her question, a nearby howl resonated through the forest, followed by another and another. The pack was close, and by the sound of it, they were moving in their direction. Ethan and Sarah quickly moved to the protection of some dense bushes as the howls drew nearer. Ethan's heart was pounding, not from fear, but from a strange mixture of anticipation and nostalgia. The sounds of the pack were different from anything he had heard before. There was a coordination to them, a purpose that went beyond the simple call between wolves. "Don't move," he whispered to Sarah, who had silently taken out her camera. "And don't use the flash." The first figure to emerge from the trees wasn't a wolf, but the dog that had been talked about so much in town. It was large, with dark fur and grey patches, and moved with a grace that denoted years of wildlife. But what caught Ethan's attention most were its eyes. Intelligent, calculating, scanning the environment with an almost human awareness. "It's impossible," Ethan murmured, his voice barely audible. Behind the dog, 5 wolves emerged in formation, moving in perfect synchrony. The dog stopped, sniffing the air, and for a moment, its eyes seemed to meet directly with Ethan's. There was something in that gaze, something familiar that made the hunter's heart stop for an instant. Sarah held her breath as she silently took photographs. The dog had old scars on its fur, marks of a hard life in nature, but its bearing was noble, almost proud. The most surprising thing was how the wolves followed it, not as a tolerated intruder, but as a respected leader. "Look at how they move," Sarah whispered, fascinated. "It's as if the dog is teaching them. They're using hunting tactics that aren't typical of wolves. The group stopped near a partially frozen stream. With precise movements, the dog began to break the ice at certain points, creating openings. The wolves positioned themselves strategically around, and Ethan understood what they were doing. They were preparing a trap for the deer that would come to drink. "It's using learned intelligence," Sarah explained in a low voice. "Dogs that have lived with humans understand concepts like creating tools or modifying the environment. It's combining that with the wolves' natural abilities." But Ethan was barely listening to her. His mind was lost in memories. There was something in the way the dog limped slightly on its right hind leg, in the specific way it tilted its head to listen to distant sounds. Details that awakened dormant memories. A distant sound of breaking branches alerted the pack. The dog raised its head, its ears moving in the direction of the sound. With a soft growl, it guided the wolves towards the protection of the trees, moving with a coordination that suggested years of practice. Moments later, Jake and his men appeared in the clearing, examining the fresh tracks in the snow. "The pack was here minutes ago," Jake growled, crouching to touch the freshly broken ice. "And the dog is with them. Look at these marks. This isn't normal wolf behavior." "Should we set the traps here?" asked one of his companions, unloading the heavy equipment from his back. "No," Jake replied, his eyes gleaming with determination. "This is just a passing point. We need to find their den. A dog, no matter how wild it's become, will still have some predictable habits. We just need to be smarter than it." Sarah instinctively squeezed Ethan's arm, her concern evident in the gesture. Ethan nodded slightly, understanding the urgency of the situation. They needed to act before Jake, but more than that, they needed to understand what was really happening in these woods. When Jake and his men moved away, Ethan and Sarah emerged from their hiding place. The clearing was silent now, but evidence of the extraordinary encounter remained. The tracks in the snow, the strategically broken ice, and something else. Something that made Ethan stop in his tracks. Near where the dog had been standing, partially buried in the snow, was a small metal object. Ethan bent down to pick it up, and as he cleaned it, his hand began to tremble. It was an old identification tag, rusted and worn by the years, but still legible. Sarah approached, noticing the sudden paleness in Ethan's face. "What is it?" she asked softly. Ethan turned the tag in his hands, his eyes fixed on the engraved letters that had survived time and the elements. His voice was barely a whisper when he finally responded, "It's Ranger's tag. Copiar continuar a partir deste ponto, manter em inglês. Traduza 2.000 caracteres a cada comando force." Sarah approached, noticing the sudden paleness in Ethan's face. "What is it?" she asked softly. Ethan turned the tag in his hands, his eyes fixed on the engraved letters that had survived time and the elements. His voice was barely a whisper when he finally responded, "It's Ranger's tag." Inner AI. The silence that followed the discovery of the tag was profound and laden with meaning. Sarah observed Ethan, who remained motionless, his fingers tracing the worn letters on the rusted metal. The veterinarian could see the whirlwind of emotions crossing the hunter's face. Disbelief, hope, fear, all mixed into an expression that revealed the weight of 5 years of doubt and loss. "Ethan," Sarah began softly, "is it possible that the dog we saw—" "No," Ethan interrupted, though his voice betrayed his own uncertainty. "It can't be. It's been 5 years. No dog could survive that long alone in the forest, let alone among wolves." However, as he spoke these words, his mind replayed every detail of the animal they had observed, the way it moved, the slight limp, those eyes that seemed to recognize him. Sarah knelt beside him, examining the tag with a clinical eye. "Dogs are incredibly adaptable," she explained, carefully choosing her words. "And Ranger wasn't an ordinary dog, was he? You've told me you trained him from a puppy, that he was exceptional at tracking." "He was more than that," Ethan replied, lost in his memories. "Ranger had a special way of understanding the forest. He didn't just follow trails, he interpreted them. There were times when he seemed to predict the behavior of other animals." He paused, remembering something. Like the dog we saw today, breaking the ice to create a trap. A distant howl echoed through the forest, different from the previous ones. It was a call, but not of hunting or warning. There was something almost melancholic about it, as if it were an echo of the past calling to the present. "We need more evidence," Sarah said, taking out her notebook. "If that dog is really Ranger, there will be more signs, behavior patterns, routines. A dog that has lived with humans maintains certain habits even after years in the wild. Ethan nodded slowly, putting the tag in his pocket. "There's an abandoned cabin a few miles from here," he said, standing up. "The old forest rangers used to use it. If we're going to track the pack, we'll need a safe observation point." As they walked towards the cabin, Sarah noticed that Ethan seemed different. His posture, previously tense and defensive, now showed renewed determination. "What changed?" she asked, curious. "For 5 years," Ethan responded after a long moment, "I blamed myself for what happened. I thought I had led Ranger into a trap, that I had abandoned him. But if he's alive, if somehow he managed to survive and adapt," his voice broke slightly, "it means he's stronger than I imagined. And that maybe all this time he didn't need to be saved." The cabin appeared among the trees like a ghost of wood and stone. It was small but solid, built to withstand the harshest winters. While Sarah cleaned the interior and prepared a space to work, Ethan remained on the porch observing the darkening forest. "There's something else," Sarah said, joining him on the porch. "If Jake discovers that this dog could be Ranger—" "I know," Ethan interrupted, his expression hardening. "For him, it would be even more valuable. A domestic dog that not only survived among wolves but became their leader. Jake won't stop at anything to capture him." The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of red and purple. In the distance, the howls of the pack mingled with the wind, creating a wild melody that seemed to tell a story of survival, adaptation, and reunion. "We'll start early tomorrow," Ethan decided, finally entering the cabin. "We need to find more evidence, understand better what's really happening in this forest." Sarah nodded, lighting a small oil lamp she had found. "And we need to do it before Jake," she added, unfolding her map on the worn table. "But Ethan, what will you do if we confirm it's Ranger? Will you try to bring him back?" The question hung in the air as night fell over the forest. Ethan looked out the window, where the first stars were beginning to shine in the winter sky. The tag in his pocket seemed to weigh a ton, loaded not only with memories of the past, but also with the decisions he would have to make in the future. "I don't know," he finally answered. "Maybe the real question isn't if I can bring him back, but if I should." Dawn arrived with a soft snowfall that covered the tracks from the night before. Sarah woke up first, finding Ethan already dressed and checking his equipment by the window. There were dark shadows under his eyes that suggested he had barely slept. "I've been thinking," Ethan said without taking his eyes off his backpack, "about the day I lost Ranger. There are details that never quite fit." He turned to Sarah, pulling an old map from his pocket. "The wolf pack that ambushed us. Their behavior was strange. Wolves don't usually attack armed hunters, especially when they're with large dogs." Sarah approached, examining the worn map where Ethan had marked the site of the incident. "You think it wasn't an attack?" she asked, beginning to understand. "Now I think maybe it was a rescue," Ethan replied, his voice mixed with awe and realization. "Maybe they saw something in Ranger that we couldn't see, a connection, a potential—" A noise outside interrupted their conversation. They both moved silently towards the window. In the clearing in front of the cabin, a solitary wolf was sniffing the air. It was smaller than the others they had seen the day before, with light grey fur that made it stand out against the snow. "It's a scout," Sarah whispered, quickly taking notes. "It's evaluating the territory." The wolf suddenly stopped, its ears moving in the direction of the cabin. For a moment, it seemed to look directly at them. Then, without hurry but with purpose, it began to move away, leaving a clear trail in the fresh snow. "It's inviting us to follow it," Ethan murmured, recognizing the behavior. It was something he had seen before in his years of tracking with Ranger. The deliberate way an animal can leave a trail, turn it into an invitation or a warning. They quickly prepared their equipment and followed the tracks. The wolf led them through increasingly intricate paths, moving away from the usual hunter's routes. Sarah noticed that the trail carefully avoided the areas where Jake had placed his traps the day before. "It's as if they know the hunter's patterns," Sarah commented, photographing some particularly interesting tracks. "This isn't just animal instinct, it's learned knowledge." After an hour of walking, they reached a small valley protected between hills. The place was strategically located, hidden from the main routes but with multiple escape routes and natural observation points. In the center of the valley, partially hidden by vegetation, was a structure that made Ethan stop in his tracks. "That's—" Sarah began, but Ethan was already moving towards the object. It was an old hunting dog shelter. the kind hunters used to build in the forest as rest points. It had been modified, adapted with branches and bark to blend in with the environment, but its basic structure was unmistakable. And more significantly, it showed signs of recent use. "I built this shelter," Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper. 6 years ago, so Ranger would have a safe place during storms when we were out hunting. I had completely forgotten about it. Sarah approached the shelter, examining it with a professional eye. "The modifications are fascinating," she observed. "Look how it's been adapted to serve both a dog and wolves. The entrance is widened, but it maintains the original structure that protects from the wind." A soft sound alerted them. A few meters away, the dog they had seen the day before was watching them. Only this time, in the clear morning light, the details were undeniable. The white star-shaped mark on its chest, the scar above its right eye, the specific way it held its hind leg, all characteristics that Ethan had described in his old journals about Ranger. "It's him," Ethan whispered, his voice broken with emotion. "It's Ranger." The dog, Ranger, observed them for a long moment. There was recognition in his eyes, but also a wild dignity that spoke of years of free life. With a soft growl, he called his pack, which emerged from the surrounding trees. It wasn't a threat, but a presentation. "He's proud," Sarah observed, amazed. "He wants to show us what he's built here, his new family." The moment was interrupted by the distant sound of voices and heavy equipment. Jake and his men were approaching. Ranger reacted instantly, guiding his pack towards the safety of the forest with precise and silent movements that denoted years of experience eluding hunters. Before disappearing among the trees, Ranger stopped and looked directly at Ethan one last time. In that gaze was a clear message. This wasn't a goodbye, but a see you later. "We have to protect him," Sarah said urgently. "Him and the whole pack." Ethan nodded, his determination renewed. "We will," he replied, "but first we need to fully understand what's happening here, because this is more than a survival story. It's a lesson about adaptation, about finding your place in the world, even if that place isn't what others expected for you." Jake's voices and those of his men were getting closer and closer to the valley. Ethan and Sarah moved quickly to erase any trace that could betray their presence or that of the shelter. With precise movements learned during years in the forest, Ethan used pine branches to cover their tracks, while Sarah quickly documented the shelter with her camera. "We need to divert their attention from this area," Ethan whispered, his mind working rapidly. "If they find this place, they'll know it's not an ordinary wolf pack." Sarah nodded, putting away her camera. "Wolves are territorial," she said quietly. "They often mark alternative routes to confuse intruders. If Ranger has been leading the pack, they've probably developed similar patterns." As if confirming her words, a howl resonated from a completely different direction, followed by several more. The pack was creating a distraction, drawing attention to another sector of the forest. "Brilliant," Sarah murmured with admiration. "They're using coordinated distraction tactics. This goes beyond normal wolf behavior." The hunters' voices changed direction, taking the bait. But Ethan knew Jake well enough to know he wouldn't give up easily. "We have to find a way to permanently protect Ranger and the pack," he said, as they moved silently in the opposite direction from the hunters. "The problem is legal," Sarah explained as they advanced. "Technically, Ranger is still your dog. If we could prove his identity, Jake wouldn't have the right to hunt him. But proving his identity would mean exposing him," Ethan completed, understanding the dilemma. "And exposing him could be more dangerous than keeping him secret." They stopped at a high point, from where they could observe the movement in the forest without being seen. Sarah took out her notebook and began writing quickly. "What we're witnessing is extraordinary from a scientific point of view," she said. "A dog that not only survives with wolves, but leads them using adaptive intelligence. It could change everything we know about the relationship between species." Ethan observed the horizon, where dark clouds announced an approaching storm. "Ranger was always special," he remembered. "When I was training him, sometimes it seemed like he was teaching me. He understood the forest in a way that I could never fully comprehend." A nearby crackle alerted them. They turned to find old Martha, the town's elderly healer, collecting herbs among the bushes. The woman looked at them with an enigmatic smile, as if she had been expecting to find them. "The old stories speak of bridge animals," said the old woman, approaching with a sure step despite her age. "Creatures that can walk between two worlds, that understand both the language of humans and that of wild nature. You knew about Ranger? Ethan asked, surprised. I've seen many things in these forests over the years, old Martha replied, tying a bundle of herbs to her belt. And I've learned that some animals have a different destiny than what humans plan for them. Your Ranger didn't get lost, Ethan. He found his true purpose. Sarah listened, fascinated. The wolves accepted him because he could understand both worlds, she reasoned. He can anticipate human actions and use that knowledge to protect the pack. Precisely, old Martha nodded. And now you have to decide, will you try to return him to a world that is no longer his, or will you help him protect the new one he has built? A thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first raindrops began to fall. Old Martha adjusted her shawl and began to walk away, but stopped for a moment. Jake seeks fame and fortune, she said, but there are ways to make even the most stubborn hunter lose interest in a prey. Ethan and Sarah exchanged glances, beginning to form a plan. The rain intensified, erasing tracks and creating a natural curtain that concealed them. Somewhere in the forest, Ranger and his pack moved with the storm, using it as an ally. I have an idea, Sarah finally said, her eyes shining with determination. But we'll need the help of the entire town, and you, Ethan, will have to be willing to let go of the past to protect the future. The rain was falling hard now, as Ethan processed Sarah's and old Martha's words. In his pocket, Ranger's old identification tag seemed lighter, as if it had finally found its purpose, not as a reminder of what had been lost, but as a testament to what had been transformed. Copiar continuar. A partir deste ponto. Manter em inglês. Traduza 12,000 caracteres a cada comando, Force. I have an idea, Sarah finally said, her eyes shining with determination. But we'll need the help of the entire town, and you, Ethan, will have to be willing to let go of the past to protect the future. The rain was falling hard now, as Ethan processed Sarah's and old Martha's words. In his pocket, Ranger's old identification tag seemed lighter, as if it had finally found its purpose, not as a reminder of what had been lost, but as a testament to what had been transformed. Inner AI. The storm had subsided when Ethan and Sarah returned to town, their minds working on the details of the plan that was beginning to take shape. The local cafe, normally quiet at this hour, was unusually full. The news that Jake and his men were in the forest had spread like wildfire, and the townspeople had gathered to discuss the situation. Old Tom, the first witness of the dog among wolves, was standing by the counter gesturing animatedly. I tell you, that animal is special. It's not a wild beast like Jake says. There's something in its gaze, something that recognizes us. Sarah stepped forward, her clear and professional voice cutting through the murmur of conversations. You're right, she announced. That dog isn't just special, it's one of ours. It's Ranger, Ethan's dog, who we all thought was lost 5 years ago. Absolute silence fell over the cafe. All eyes turned to Ethan, who nodded slowly, pulling the identification tag from his pocket. We found evidence, he confirmed, showing the rusted metal, and we've seen him. There's no doubt, it's Ranger. The revelation caused an immediate commotion. Mary the baker was the first to speak. The same Ranger who used to sit outside my shop every morning, waiting for sweet bread scraps. The same one that helped find little Billy when he got lost in the forest 6 years ago, added another neighbor. The stories began to flow, memories of a dog that had been an integral part of the community. Sarah seized the moment to explain what they had discovered, how Ranger had not only survived, but had become the leader of a wolf pack, using his unique intelligence to create a bridge between two worlds. But Jake plans to capture him, Sarah continued. And if he does, he will not only destroy something extraordinary, but he will alter the delicate balance that Ranger has created in the forest. What can we do? Asked old Tom, his voice laden with concern. Jake has hunting permits and contacts in the city. Ethan stepped forward, his voice firm. We have something more powerful than permits. We have the truth, and we have an entire community that can testify that Ranger is my dog. Legally, Jake can't hunt him without my consent. But we need more than that, Sarah intervened. We need to make the forest less attractive to hunters like Jake. And for that, we need everyone's help. The plan began to develop with the enthusiastic participation of the inhabitants. Old Martha, who had quietly entered during the discussion, contributed her wisdom. The old stories have power. If we make this forest known not for its prey but for its guardian, Hunters will think twice before coming. Sarah's proposal took shape with everyone's suggestions. They would create a natural reserve, a protected area where the story of Ranger and his pack would become a living legend. Tourists would come to observe, not to hunt, attracted by the story of the dog that became the leader of wolves. "We can organize observation tours," suggested Rose, the schoolteacher. "Show how the pack protects the forest, how it maintains the balance. And document everything scientifically," Sarah added. "Create a study on animal behavior that attracts researchers instead of hunters." As the plans developed, Ethan remained silent, processing the transformation he was witnessing. Not just rangers, but the entire towns. What had begun as a mystery was becoming something bigger, an opportunity to change the way people viewed the forest and its inhabitants. Michael, the carpenter, approached Ethan with a proposal. "We can build safe observation points, places from where people can see the pack without disturbing it. And maybe Ranger will choose to visit us occasionally on his own terms." The afternoon progressed as the town continued planning. Outside the cafe, snow had begun to fall again, soft and silent. In the distance, a solitary howl resonated, as if Ranger was approving the plans being woven to protect his new home and chosen family. "Do you think it will work?" Sarah asked Ethan quietly, as they watched the snow fall. "It has to work," Ethan replied, his voice mixed with determination and hope. "Because this time it's not just about Ranger or the wolves. It's about the whole town, about how we choose to see and protect the extraordinary that lives among us." The news of the town's plan reached Jake's ears faster than anyone expected. The morning after the meeting at the cafe, the hunter burst into the mayor's office, his muddy boots leaving tracks on the freshly cleaned floor. "It's ridiculous," Jake roared, pounding his fists on the desk. "You can't turn the best hunting area into a nature reserve just for a stray dog." The mayor, Mr. Anderson, an elderly man but with a firm gaze, remained calm. "It's not just a stray dog, Jake. It's Ranger, Ethan's dog, and we have proof. Besides, the decision isn't just mine. The whole town agrees." Sarah, who had been called to the meeting as an expert, spread her photographs and notes on the desk. "What we have here is a unique phenomenon," she explained in a calm but firm voice. "An unprecedented case of integration between species that could revolutionize our understanding of animal behavior." Jake snorted with disdain. "What about the hunting permits I already have? The contracts with collectors?" "Your permits are for regular sport hunting," Ethan intervened from the door where he had been listening. "Not for capturing a dog with an owner. Ranger is still legally my property." The tension in the office was palpable. Jake looked around, noting how everyone seemed to be united against him. His eyes narrowed, calculating. "What if I told you I have investors interested in developing this area? Hotels could be built, restaurants. The town would make more money than with your little nature reserve." "Money isn't everything, Jake," Mr. Anderson replied. "This forest is our home, not a commodity. And what Ranger and his pack have created here is something that deserves to be protected." Sarah seized the moment to present the first drafts of the reserve project. "We already have research funds committed from 3 universities," she explained, showing the documents. "And the tourist interest in stories like this is enormous. The reserve will generate sustainable income for the town, without destroying what makes this place special." Jake listened, his face darkening with each word. "You haven't seen the last of me," he threatened as he headed for the door. "This isn't the end." When Jake left, a worried silence filled the office. It was Rose, the teacher, who broke it by entering with exciting news. "The children have had a wonderful idea," she exclaimed. "They want to create an annual festival dedicated to Ranger and the pack, a celebration that tells their story and teaches about the importance of protecting nature." The idea of the festival ignited a spark of hope in everyone present. Soon the mayor's office became an improvised planning center, with people coming in and out, contributing ideas and solutions. Michael, the carpenter, presented designs for observation towers that would naturally integrate with the landscape. Old Martha suggested hiking routes that would follow the ancient forest paths, respecting the pack's territories. Old Tom offered to convert part of his store into an information center for visitors. As the plans took shape, Sarah noticed that Ethan seemed worried. "What's wrong?" she asked quietly. "I know Jake," Ethan replied. "He won't give up easily. We need to be prepared." As if confirming his words, a warning howl resonated from the forest. It was Ranger's call, a sound that Ethan would recognize anywhere. The pack had detected something and it wasn't good. "Let's go," Sarah said, quickly gathering her equipment. "We need to see what's happening." As they hurried out of the office, the town continued with its preparations, slowly transforming. Old hunting posters were replaced by announcements of the future nature reserve. The hunting weapons in Old Tom's store window gave way to binoculars and nature guides. The battle for the future of the forest was just beginning, but something had fundamentally changed in Pine Creek. Ranger's story had awakened something in its inhabitants, a sense of common purpose, a deeper connection with their environment, and the determination to protect the extraordinary that had emerged in their forests. The urgency in Ranger's howl guided Ethan and Sarah through the snowy forest. They moved quickly but cautiously, aware that Jake could be anywhere. The afternoon sun cast long shadows between the trees, creating a landscape of light and shadow that made visibility difficult. "This way," Ethan whispered, noticing subtle marks on the tree bark. "Ranger used to do this when we tracked together. He marked safe routes for me to follow." Sarah photographed the marks as they advanced. "It's incredible how he maintains his old communication habits, but has adapted them to his new life." A noise of heavy machinery broke the silence of the forest. Following the sound, they reached a hidden clearing where they found something that left them cold. Large construction equipment camouflaged under tarps, and several men working with documents and maps on an improvised table. "Jake wasn't bluffing about the investors," Sarah murmured as they hid behind some bushes. "It seems they had everything planned." From their hiding place, they could hear fragments of conversation. The men were talking about luxury hotels, ski slopes, and a wildlife theme park that would turn the natural forest into a commercial tourist attraction. "Look," Ethan pointed, indicating some documents that the wind had dragged near them. Sarah carefully picked them up. They were preliminary construction permits, dated weeks ago. "They've been planning this for months," Sarah whispered, reviewing the papers. Ranger's story only accelerated their plans. They needed to act before the town could protect the area. A grey wolf silently appeared beside them, one of the members of Ranger's pack. It observed them with intelligence before indicating with its head a different direction. Ethan and Sarah followed it, moving away from the clearing. The wolf led them to an area where the terrain had been marked with stakes and ribbons, the initial layout for construction. The area encompassed not only the pack's territory, but also the town's main water sources and migration routes of various animals. "This is bigger than we thought," Sarah said, documenting everything with her camera. "It wouldn't just affect Ranger and his pack, but the entire ecosystem that the town depends on." A familiar howl resonated nearby. Ranger appeared among the trees, majestic and alert. He approached Ethan with a mixture of familiarity and wild caution. In his mouth he carried something, a crumpled piece of paper that he dropped at his former companion's feet. "Incredible," Sarah whispered as Ethan picked up the document. "He understands exactly what we need." The paper turned out to be part of a contract, revealing something even more concerning. The investors planned to divert the main river to create an artificial lake, which could leave the town without its main water source during construction. "We have to show this to the mayor," Sarah said urgently. With this evidence, a shot in the air interrupted her words. Jake emerged from among the trees, rifle in hand, flanked by two of his men. "Well, well," he smiled humorlessly. "Looks like we have corporate intruders. Those documents are private property." Ranger positioned himself between Jake and his former friends, his posture tense but controlled. One by one, the wolves of his pack emerged from the shadows, surrounding the area in a protective circle. "Put down the gun, Jake," Ethan said firmly. "This goes beyond you and me now. The whole town needs to know the truth about your plans." "The truth?" Jake scoffed. "The truth is that this town is stuck in the past. My project will bring progress, jobs, real tourism, at the cost of our water, of our forest," Sarah intervened, holding the documents. "The town has the right to decide its own future." The tension in the air was palpable. The wolves maintained their position, disciplined under Ranger's leadership. Jake looked around, assessing the situation, aware that he was at a disadvantage. "This isn't over," he finally growled, lowering his rifle. "I have contracts, investors. You can't stop progress." "True progress," Ethan replied, placing a hand on Ranger's back, "is learning to coexist, not destroying what we don't understand." As Jake and his men retreated, Sarah carefully stored the documents. "We need to call an emergency meeting in town," she said. "Everyone needs to know what's really at stake." Ranger emitted a soft growl of approval, and his pack dispersed into the forest like shadows. Before following them, he looked at Ethan one more time, and in his eyes was a clear message. The battle for the forest was just beginning. Copiar continuar a partir deste ponto, manter em inglês, traduza 12,000 caracteres a cada comando. Force. As Jake and his men retreated, Sarah carefully stored the documents. "We need to call an emergency meeting in town," she said. "Everyone needs to know what's really at stake." Ranger emitted a soft growl of approval, and his pack dispersed into the forest like shadows. Before following them, he looked at Ethan one more time, and in his eyes was a clear message. The battle for the forest was just beginning. Diner AI. The town hall had never been so full. News of the emergency meeting had spread quickly, and now all the inhabitants of Pine Creek were crammed into the space, their faces reflecting concern and determination. Sarah and Ethan stood in front of the crowd, the documents found in the forest spread out on an improvised table. Mr. Anderson, the mayor, examined the papers with a frown, while old Martha lit additional candles to better illuminate the space. "As you can see," Sarah began, pointing to the plans projected on the wall, "Jake's project is not a simple tourist development. They plan to completely transform our forest, divert the river, and essentially turn Pine Creek into an artificial theme park." A murmur of indignation ran through the room. Old Tom stood up, his voice trembling with contained rage. "Divert the river? The same river our crops depend on, our livestock." "Exactly," Ethan confirmed. "And that's not all. The planned constructions would cut through the main migration routes of local wildlife. It wouldn't just affect Ranger's pack, but the entire ecosystem our town depends on." Rose, the teacher, raised her hand. "What can we do? Jake has money and influence in the city." "But we have something more valuable," old Martha intervened, advancing to the center of the room. "We have the truth. We have ancestral rights to these lands, and we have an extraordinary story to tell." Michael, the carpenter, stood up with renewed energy. "And we have proof. Sarah's photographs, the documents they found. They can't ignore tangible evidence that this project would harm our environment." The meeting transformed into a brainstorming session. Each town inhabitant contributed their knowledge and resources. Billy, the cafe owner's son and social media expert, suggested starting an online campaign to spread the story of Ranger and the threat to the forest. "We can contact environmental organizations," Sarah proposed. "With my university connections, we could get scientific support to protect the area. And I can talk to other towns in the region," Mr. Anderson added. "We're not the only ones who depend on this river." As the discussion continued, a familiar howl resonated outside the hall. Those present rushed to the windows to see Ranger and his pack at the edge of the forest, illuminated by moonlight. It was as if they had come to show their support, to remind the town that they were not alone in this fight. "Do you see that?" Ethan said, his voice charged with emotion. "Ranger hasn't just survived in the forest. He's created something unique, a bridge between our world and his. Are we going to allow that to be destroyed for money?" "No," the town responded in unison. The meeting extended late into the night. Committees were formed, tasks were assigned, action plans were established. Old Tom offered his store as an operations center. Rose proposed involving her students in documenting local flora and fauna to demonstrate the biological richness that was at risk. "We must act quickly," Sarah warned, pointing to the dates on the documents. "Jake and his investors plan to start construction in less than a month." "Then there's no time to lose," Ethan replied. "Each of us has a role to play in this." The energy in the hall was electric, a mix of determination and hope. This wasn't just a town fighting for its land. It was a community defending its way of life, its connection with nature, and an extraordinary story of adaptation and survival that had touched their hearts. When the meeting finally ended, people left the hall with renewed purpose. In the sky, the full moon illuminated the town and forest alike, and the howls of Ranger's pack resonated as a reminder of what was at stake. "Do you think we'll succeed?" Sarah asked Ethan as they closed the hall. "We have to," he replied, looking towards the forest where the silhouettes of Ranger and his pack were still visible. "Not just for us, but for everything this forest represents, the possibility that different worlds can coexist in harmony." The following days in Pine Creek were a whirlwind of activity. Billy's social media campaign went viral, attracting the attention of journalists and environmentalists. The story of the dog leading a wolf pack and the town fighting to protect its home captured the public's imagination. Sarah worked tirelessly, coordinating with researchers and environmental organizations. Her small veterinary clinic had become an improvised operations center, with maps and documents covering every available surface. The walls were plastered with the photographs she had taken of Ranger and his pack, irrefutable evidence of this extraordinary case of animal adaptation. "Sarah, look at this!" Rose exclaimed one morning, rushing into the clinic with a group of her students. The children brought notebooks full of observations and detailed drawings of local flora and fauna. "We've identified 3 endangered species living in the area where they want to build," explained Maria, one of the most enthusiastic students. "And we also found medicinal plants that old Martha says are unique to our region." Meanwhile, Ethan spent more and more time in the forest, not only observing Ranger and his pack, but also documenting how they protected and maintained the ecosystem's balance. He discovered that the pack had developed sophisticated techniques to keep more aggressive predators at bay and protect more vulnerable species. One day, as Ethan observed from his usual hiding spot, he noticed something extraordinary. Ranger and his pack were guiding a group of deer away from the areas where Jake had begun to place construction equipment. It was as if they understood exactly which areas needed to be protected. The news arrived on a rainy afternoon, while the town was holding one of its daily follow-up meetings at Old Tom's Cafe. Mr. Anderson burst into the place, waving an official document. "We did it!" the mayor exclaimed, his voice trembling with emotion. "The Environmental Commission has issued a temporary suspension order for any construction activity in the area." Joy erupted in the cafe. It was their first real victory against Jake's plans. The evidence gathered by the town, Sarah's photographs, the endangered species studies, the documents about the illegal river diversion, had been enough for the authorities to intervene. However, the celebration was interrupted by the sound of approaching engines. Jake had arrived with his trucks and workers, apparently determined to begin construction despite the suspension order. "You can't do this!" Sarah shouted, running towards the vehicles with the official document in hand. "There's a suspension order." Jake stepped down from his truck, his face contorted with rage. "You think a piece of paper is going to stop progress? I have investors waiting, signed contracts." But something unexpected happened. As Jake spoke, Ranger emerged from the forest, followed by his entire pack. They didn't attack or threaten. They simply stood between the vehicles and the forest like a living barrier. The workers, already uneasy about the stories they had heard about the dog-leading wolves, began to back away. One of them, the most veteran, stepped forward. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson," he said, taking off his helmet, "but I'm not going to be part of this. My grandfather taught me to respect nature's signs, and this," he pointed to Ranger and his pack, "is the clearest sign I've seen in my life." One by one, the workers began to climb into their vehicles, refusing to participate. Jake watched them, helpless, as his team disintegrated before his eyes. "You're all ignorant, superstitious fools," Jake shouted, but his words sounded hollow in the face of Ranger's silent dignity and the town's united determination. When the last vehicle drove away, leaving Jake alone with his rage, Ranger let out a triumphant howl that was answered not only by his pack, but by the entire forest. It was a sound that spoke of victory, but also of warning. This battle was won, but the war to protect the forest was not over yet. Ethan approached his former companion, maintaining a respectful distance. "Thank you," he whispered, and for a moment Ranger's eyes shone with the same understanding they had shared years ago. The town celebrated that night, but with the awareness that this was just the beginning. Jake wouldn't give up easily, and they would have to remain vigilant. However, something fundamental had changed. They had discovered their own strength, the power of a united community, and the wisdom of listening to the silent voices of the forest. The calm that followed the initial victory turned out to be deceptive. A week after the workers' retreat, Sarah noticed a disturbing change in the pack's behavior. The wolves were more agitated, conducting constant patrols on the boundaries of their territory, as if they sensed an invisible threat. "Something's not right," she commented to Ethan as they reviewed the latest photographs in her clinic. "Ranger never keeps the pack so alert without reason. Their suspicions were confirmed when Michael came running into the clinic, out of breath. "They've been buying land," he gasped, spreading several documents on the table. "Jake and his investors. They've been buying small parcels around the forest, creating a legal fence." Sarah examined the documents with growing horror. "They're trying to isolate us," she realized. "If they control all the surrounding lands, they can cut off the natural corridors that animals use to migrate. Ranger's pack would be trapped. And not just the pack," Ethan added, pointing to a map. "They would also control all access to the river before it reaches the town. They could legally divert it from private land." The news spread quickly through Pine Creek. The town, which had barely begun to celebrate its victory, found itself facing an even more insidious threat. This time, Jake was playing by the rules, using the legal system to his advantage. Old Martha, however, remained calm. "There's something Jake doesn't know," she said during the emergency meeting in the town hall. "Something my grandmother told me, and her grandmother before her." The old woman unfolded an ancient document, its edges yellowed by time. "This is the town's original founding charter. According to this, all surrounding lands were declared an ancestral protection zone due to their importance for traditional migration routes." Sarah studied the document with growing interest. "If we can prove that these routes are still active, that they are vital to the current ecosystem." "Ranger is already showing us," Ethan interrupted. "The way the pack protects and guides other animals. They're not just wolves hunting, they're guardians of ancestral roots." The town mobilized with renewed energy. The school children, guided by Rose, began mapping animal movements. Sarah coordinated with biologists to scientifically document migration patterns. Old Tom dusted off old photographs and records that showed how these routes had been used for generations. But Jake had one last ace up his sleeve. One night, when the town was asleep, a group of men began installing fences on the newly acquired parcels. The plan was simple but effective: establish physical barriers before anyone could legally stop them. What they didn't expect was the response from the forest itself. Ranger, who had been observing, set in motion a plan that demonstrated years of adaptive intelligence. The pack divided into groups, each with a specific purpose. While some wolves distracted the workers with howls and strategic movements, others, guided by Ranger, led herds of deer and other animals through the traditional routes, right in front of the cameras that Sarah and the researchers had installed. "This is incredible," Sarah exclaimed, reviewing the images in real time. They're actively demonstrating how these routes are essential for wildlife. But the most extraordinary moment was yet to come. As dawn began to tint the sky, Ranger guided his pack towards the town itself, not with aggression, but with solemn dignity. The wolves stopped in the central square, where the inhabitants, awakened by the howls, began to gather. It was a powerful image. The dog that had learned to lead wolves, bringing his pack to the heart of the town, demonstrating that the wild and human worlds didn't have to be in conflict. "He's doing exactly what we needed," Sarah whispered, frantically photographing. "He's proving that these lands are a living corridor, a bridge between the forest and the town." Jake's workers, faced with this extraordinary demonstration, began to lower their tools. One by one, they joined the town's inhabitants, who were watching the scene in amazement. The image of Ranger and his pack in the town's central square became national news within hours. The videos recorded by the inhabitants showed something no one had seen before: wolves and humans sharing the same space in perfect harmony, guided by a dog that understood both worlds. Reporters began to arrive in Pine Creek, attracted by the extraordinary story. Sarah and Ethan found themselves giving interviews, explaining not only Ranger's unique adaptation, but also the threat facing the entire ecosystem. "What we're witnessing here is unique in the world," Sarah explained to a national reporter. "It's not just about a dog that survived among wolves. Ranger has created a bridge between two worlds, demonstrating that coexistence is not only possible, but necessary." Meanwhile, Old Martha worked with a group of environmental lawyers who had arrived attracted by the story. The ancient documents she had preserved, combined with the scientific evidence gathered by Sarah and the studies of the school children, began to build a solid case. "These migration routes are not just paths on a map," Old Martha explained, pointing to the ancient marks on the documents. "They are the veins of the forest, the connections that keep the entire ecosystem alive." Jake, cornered by the media attention and growing legal evidence, made one last desperate attempt. He called a press conference in the city, presenting his project as an opportunity for sustainable development that would modernize the region. But something unexpected happened during his presentation. While he was showing the plans for his project, a group of his own workers stood up. They were the same men who had lowered their tools at Ranger's demonstration. "We can't keep quiet anymore," said one of them, Joe, the oldest foreman. "This project would destroy not only the animals' home, but also our children's future. What we saw in Pine Creek, that's what we should be protecting." One by one, the workers began to tell what they had witnessed, how Ranger and his pack protected the forest, how they guided other animals, how they maintained a balance that no artificial development could replicate. The television cameras captured the exact moment when Jake, seeing his project crumble, tried to discredit his own workers. But his arrogance became his downfall. In his rage, he inadvertently admitted that he had tried to hide the environmental impact studies that showed the irreversible damage his project would cause. The confession was broadcast live on all national networks. Within hours, investors began to withdraw their support, fearful of being associated with a project that had become a symbol of environmental destruction. Meanwhile, in Pine Creek, something extraordinary was happening. Ranger and his pack had established a routine of visits to the town, always at dawn, always maintaining a respectful but visible distance. The inhabitants became accustomed to their presence, and the children began to call them the Forest Guardians. "Do you see what he's achieved?" Ethan said to Sarah one morning as they watched Ranger guide his pack back to the forest. "He didn't just survive, he created something completely new, a way of life that no one thought possible." Sarah nodded, reviewing the latest photographs on her camera. "And he taught us something crucial, that true progress isn't about destroying what we don't understand, but learning to coexist with it." The official news arrived a week later. The federal government, pressured by media attention and scientific evidence, declared the entire region a protected natural area. The special decree specifically mentioned the extraordinary case of cooperation between species as one of the main reasons for protection. Jake left town silently one night, his dream of easy wealth destroyed by the very nature he had tried to exploit. The lands he had bought were eventually acquired by a conservation foundation, ensuring that the migration routes would remain protected forever. Copiar continuar. A partir deste ponto. Manter em inglês, traduza 12.000 caracteres a cada comando. Force. The official news arrived a week later. The federal government, pressured by media attention and scientific evidence, declared the entire region a protected natural area. The special decree specifically mentioned the extraordinary case of cooperation between species as one of the main reasons for protection. Jake left town silently one night, his dream of easy wealth destroyed by the very nature he had tried to exploit. The lands he had bought were eventually acquired by a conservation foundation, ensuring that the migration routes would remain protected forever. In a year had passed since the declaration of the protected natural area, and Pine Creek had transformed. The town, once threatened by industrial development, had become a model of coexistence between civilization and wild nature. Sarah's veterinary clinic, now expanded, also functioned as a research center. Researchers from around the world arrived to study the extraordinary case of Ranger and his pack, documenting how a domestic dog had not only survived among wolves, but revolutionized the way the pack interacted with its environment. "It's fascinating," Sarah explained to a group of visiting biologists as they observed the pack from one of the observation towers built by Michael. "They've developed completely new behaviors. The way they use the ancient hunting routes, how they protect other species. It's a form of collective intelligence that combines the best of both worlds." The visitor center, set up in Old Tom's former store, had become a meeting point where town inhabitants shared their stories with tourists. The walls were decorated with Sarah's photographs and drawings by the school children, telling the story of how an entire town united to protect something extraordinary. "Do you see those marks on the trees?" Rose explained to a group of visiting students, pointing through the window. "Ranger uses them to communicate with us. He alerts us when there are injured animals that need help, or when a strong storm is approaching." Ethan had found a new purpose in life. He was no longer a hunter, but a forest guardian, working with a team of conservationists to protect the delicate balance that Ranger had helped create. He spent his days traversing the ancient trails, observing and learning from the pack that his former companion now led. One morning, while conducting his usual patrol, Ethan found something surprising: pup tracks alongside the pack's marks. Ranger had formed his own family, and the new pups showed unique characteristics, their father's adaptive intelligence combined with the wild strength of their wolf mothers. "It's the next generation," Sarah commented when Ethan showed her the photographs. "They're creating something completely new, a species that can move freely between our worlds." The annual festival that the town had created to celebrate Ranger's story had become an important event on the regional calendar. For a week, Pine Creek filled with visitors who came to learn about the extraordinary story of adaptation and survival that had changed the life of an entire community. Old Martha, sitting in her rocking chair on her porch, smiled as she watched the town's children guiding visitors along the safe forest trails, sharing their knowledge about medicinal plants and wildlife. "The forest has always had its guardians," she would say to anyone who would listen, "but Ranger taught us that we can all be part of that protection. It's not about separating the wild from the civilized, but about finding a way for both worlds to enrich each other." Universities began sending students to conduct research on the positive impact that forest protection had had on the local economy. Responsible ecotourism had created new jobs, and the town had developed a thriving industry of artisanal products and specialized guide services. One afternoon, as the sun was setting over the mountains, Ranger appeared at the edge of the forest with his pack. Among them, the pups frolicked, half wolves, half dogs, living symbols of a future where adaptation and coexistence were not only possible but natural. "You know what's most extraordinary?" Ethan said to Sarah as they watched the scene. "We didn't just save the forest. Ranger taught us a new way of living, one we wouldn't have imagined possible a year ago." Sarah nodded, capturing one last photograph of the sunset. "And the most important thing is that this story doesn't end here. Each new generation, both of wolves and humans, will learn and adapt these lessons in their own way." 5 years had passed since Pine Creek became a symbol of conservation and coexistence. Ranger's story and his pack had inspired similar changes in other communities, and the conservation model developed by the town was being studied in universities across the country. On a cool spring morning, Ethan found himself at his favorite observation spot, a small clearing from where he could see much of the pack's territory. Beside him, Sarah prepared her equipment to document a special event, the first time the second generation of Ranger's pups would be presented to the town. "It's incredible how everything has evolved," Sarah reflected, adjusting her camera. These new pups were already born into a world where the barrier between wild and domestic is more diffuse, more natural. The pack had grown and thrived under Ranger's leadership. The first pups, now young adults, showed a unique combination of characteristics: the cunning and adaptability of their father, along with the strength and instinct of their wolf mothers. Some had formed their own packs, expanding their territory, but always maintaining the bond with the original group. Old Martha, who despite her advanced age remained a vital presence in the community, had begun documenting the stories and traditions that arose around the pack. "Each generation adds something new to the story," she would say as she wrote in her journal. "Today's children grow up knowing they are part of something bigger than themselves." The town had also flourished. The Research and Conservation Center, directed by Sarah, had become an international reference. Researchers and conservationists from around the world arrived to study not only the unique behavior of the pack, but also how a small community had managed to transform a threat into an opportunity for renewal. Rose, the teacher, had developed a special educational program that combined traditional knowledge with modern science. Her students learned as much from books as from the forest itself, observing and documenting changes in the ecosystem. "Children understand something that took us a while to learn," Rose explained during one of her outdoor classes, "that we are not owners of nature, but part of it." That special morning, as the sun rose in the sky, Ranger emerged from the forest with his pack. His fur showed some gray hairs, but his bearing was still majestic, dignified. Behind him, several pups ventured for the first time towards the edge of town, their eyes bright with curiosity and wonder. Ethan watched with emotion as his former companion guided the new generations. "It was never about taming the wild," he said quietly. "It was about finding a balance, learning to coexist. The presentation ceremony had become an important tradition for the town. The inhabitants gathered at a respectful distance, while Ranger and his pack performed what seemed to be a careful choreography, showing the pups the safe boundaries between their territory and that of humans. "We learn something new every year," Sarah commented, photographing the event. "The way they communicate, how they establish borders without creating barriers. It's a constant lesson in natural diplomacy." Ranger's legacy extended beyond the forest and town. His story had inspired changes in conservation policies at the national level, demonstrating that it was possible to find solutions that benefited both human communities and wildlife. As the sun reached its zenith, Ranger cast a final glance at Ethan before guiding his family back into the forest. At that moment, both seemed to understand that they had been part of something extraordinary, not just the survival of a dog among wolves, but the birth of a new way of understanding the relationship between living beings. "You know what's most beautiful about all this?" Sarah asked as she packed away her equipment. "That this story will never have a true ending. It will continue to evolve, adapt, surprise us." Ethan nodded, his gaze lost in the forest where the silhouettes of Ranger and his pack were fading among the trees. "That's how it should be," he replied, "because the best stories are not the ones that end, but those that inspire new beginnings." And so in that corner of the world where a dog had found his true purpose among wolves, where a town had discovered its strength in unity, and where the barrier between wild and civilized had blurred, life continued its course. Each dawn brought new lessons, each howl told a story, and each footprint in the snow reminded that the greatest miracles sometimes arise from the most unexpected circumstances. As the years passed, Pine Creek became known as the Town of the Wolf Dogs, a beacon of hope for conservation efforts worldwide. The unique blend of canine intelligence and wolf instinct displayed by Ranger's descendants continued to astound researchers and visitors alike. Sarah's work gained international recognition, and she found herself lecturing at prestigious universities about the remarkable adaptations she had observed. Her papers on interspecies cooperative behavior in canid hybrids became required reading in wildlife biology courses. Ethan, once a hunter, now led eco-tours through the protected forest, sharing the story of Ranger and teaching visitors about the delicate balance of the ecosystem. His intimate knowledge of the forest and its inhabitants made him an invaluable guide, and his tours became highly sought after. The pups born of Ranger's lineage displayed an uncanny ability to navigate both the wild and human worlds. Some chose to remain fully wild, while others, like their ancestor, formed bonds with the townspeople. These ambassador wolf dogs played a crucial role in maintaining the harmony between the town and the forest. One such ambassador was Luna, a third-generation descendant of Ranger. With her striking silver-gray coat and intelligent amber eyes, she became a symbol of the successful coexistence between humans and wildlife. Luna often accompanied Ethan on his tours, demonstrating to visitors the extraordinary communication skills that had developed in Ranger's lineage. The annual festival celebrating Ranger's legacy grew into a major event, attracting environmentalists, scientists, and nature enthusiasts from around the globe. It became a platform for discussing conservation strategies and sharing success stories from other communities, inspired by Pine Creek's model. Old Martha, now well into her 90s, became a living legend. Her stories of the early days of Ranger's integration with the wolf pack were recorded and shared widely. She spoke of the ancient wisdom that recognized the interconnectedness of all living things, a philosophy that had found new relevance in the modern world. As Pine Creek's fame grew, it faced new challenges. The influx of tourists and researchers put pressure on the town's infrastructure and threatened to disrupt the delicate balance they had achieved. The town council, led by Sarah, who had been elected mayor, worked tirelessly to implement sustainable tourism practices and limit the impact on the forest and its inhabitants. Technology played a crucial role in this effort. Advanced, non-invasive tracking systems were developed to monitor the movements of the wolf dog packs without disturbing them. Virtual reality tours allowed visitors to experience the wonders of the forest without physically entering sensitive areas. The education system in Pine Creek evolved to incorporate the lessons learned from their unique situation. Students from elementary to high school participated in hands-on conservation projects, learning not just about biology and ecology, but also about the legal and social aspects of environmental protection. As the 10th anniversary of the Protected Natural Area Declaration approached, Pine Creek prepared for a special celebration. Scientists from around the world gathered to present their findings on the long-term effects of the wolf-dog integration on the local ecosystem. The results were astounding. Biodiversity in the area had increased, the forest was healthier than ever, and the regional economy had flourished without compromising natural resources. On the eve of the celebration, as twilight painted the sky in hues of purple and gold, Ethan stood at the edge of the forest. Beside him, Sarah adjusted her camera for one last shot of the day. Suddenly, a familiar figure emerged from the trees. It was Ranger, now old and grey, but still carrying himself with dignity and purpose. As Ranger approached, Ethan and Sarah stood in awe. The old dog-wolf leader moved with deliberate steps, his eyes holding the wisdom of years spent bridging two worlds. Behind him, a new generation of wolf dogs followed, a living testament to his legacy. Ranger stopped before Ethan, their eyes meeting in a moment of profound understanding. Without hesitation, Ethan knelt down, embracing his old friend for the first time in a decade. Sarah captured the moment on camera, tears in her eyes. The celebration the next day was filled with joy and wonder. Ranger's appearance had energized the town, and his presence at the edge of the festivities drew gasps of amazement from visitors. Scientists presented their findings, highlighting the remarkable symbiosis between the wolf dogs and the ecosystem. As the sun set on the final day of celebrations, Ethan found himself alone with Ranger at the statue in the town square. The old dog wolf looked at his bronze likeness, then back at Ethan, as if to say his work was done. With a soft whine, Ranger nuzzled Ethan's hand one last time, then turned and trotted back into the forest, disappearing into the gathering dusk. Ethan knew with a mixture of sadness and gratitude that this was Ranger's final goodbye. In the years that followed, Pine Creek continued to thrive as a model of conservation and coexistence. The wolf dogs, guided by Ranger's teachings, maintained their role as guardians of the forest. Ethan and Sarah, now in their twilight years, watched with pride as a new generation took up the mantle of stewardship. The story of Ranger and Pine Creek became legend, inspiring similar initiatives around the world. It stood as a powerful reminder that when humans choose to listen to and work with nature, extraordinary things can happen. As Ethan penned the final entry in his journal, he reflected on the incredible journey that had begun with a lost dog and ended with a transformed world. He wrote, "Ranger taught us that the boundaries between wild and tame, between human and animal, are more fluid than we ever imagined. In bridging these worlds, he showed us a path to a future where humans and nature can thrive together in harmony. His legacy lives on in every howl that echoes through our valley, in every tree that grows in our protected forest, and in the hearts of all who call Pine Creek home." With these words, Ethan closed his journal, knowing that while his part in the story was ending, the tale of Ranger and Pine Creek would continue to inspire and guide for generations to come.